You're listening to What Ray's Saying, the podcast. Now, what a better way to go forward than to pick up where I left off. The Storyteller's Journey, Part 3. What happens when you experience success in a very narrowly defined area that could be seen as entertainment?
What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying?
From the source of all black knowledge, doctorate complete, severe illness and recovery with a fresh haircut after 7 months, sending the hog off to processing, still unsponsored and unregulated. You're listening to What Ray's Saying, the podcast. Stories on a bigger stage, a life story, and commentary about the value of the lived experience. Coming up. If you had just a moment to tell your life story to someone, could you do it? What if you had 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 12, 10 minutes? What if it were the last thing you were ever going to say? What if your life depended on it? When I was approached by the senior producer of The Moth, Jennifer Hickson, to be one of the local tellers from North Carolina when they were doing a show at the Carolina Theater in Durham, I had only had this fragment of a pitch that I had sent them some time ago in the past. It probably ended up in that stack of dead pitches from the past, pitches in various forms of decomposition. But in just looking over my life and the reality of time, production, and all the other crafting elements and constraints that came with putting a story together, an essence of my life story emerged, and I was given the opportunity to tell this story on the Moth main stage, a total of 4 times, once in Toronto, Canada. And here it is, Life Reimagined. I remember standing in line at the Social Security office with my mama. I was 10 years old, and the line moved ahead slowly. But I could hear the lady at the front of the line saying, "Next, go to the desk. Next, fill out the form." My mother and I got to the front of the desk, and my mother looked at the form, and she started to ask the lady a question. She said, "Excuse me, can I?" And the lady cut her off and said, "Ma'am, take the form, take it to the desk, fill it out, and come back. Next. My mother looked at the form again, and she looked at the lady, and she started to ask her the question again. She said, "Excuse me, ma'am, can I?" The lady cut her off and said, "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. Take the form to the desk, fill it out, and bring it back. Next." My mother and I walked to the desk, and my mother looked at the form, and I could tell that water was starting to well up in her eyes. And I said, "Mama, what's wrong?" And she said, "Baby, Mama can't read." And I looked at her, and I said, "Mom, that first line, it says name." She said, "Can you write that?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "My name is Annie Christian." And I wrote out her name. And the next line said address. I said, "Mama, that's where we live." She told me, I wrote it. And we went all the way down the form this way until we got to the last line. And it had a word that I was not quite familiar with. It sounded like signature. And she said, "What's that?" I said, "Mama, I think that's when you write your name real squiggly like." And she said, "I can do that." And she did. And she looked at me and she started to cry and she hugged me real tight. And she said, "You will never know what it's like to be ignorant." Now, I didn't know what she was talking about. I'm 10 years old. All I know is I was doing something to help my mama. And because my mama and my daddy both were illiterate and they wanted to encourage my reading, they decided to go out and buy me all these pretty books that had pretty pictures on them. So as a 10-year-old, I started to gather up a real big collection of books. I had General Principles of Engineering, Ron L. Hubbard's Dianetics, General Psychopathology, Sex After 60, and Green Eggs and Ham. So I was ready for the world with that. But my folks loved me enough that if I had decided to drop out of school and got a job working at the factory and stayed out of trouble with the police, they would have been happy for me. But I wanted more than that out of life. I wanted those things I was reading in those books. And because I was a marginal student and a marginal athlete, there was little or no chance of me going to college or getting any kind of scholarship at all. But there was one organization that was offering me a job, and that was the United States Army. Now, thinking that the harder the job is, the more money you'd get paid, I said to the recruiter, "Give me the hardest job you got." And they did. I became a paratrooper, and I had never been on an airplane before in my life. Well, at some point, the Army went from being my stepping stone in life to my island, and I decided to re-enlist. But no amount of toughness or hardness can help you get promoted in the military without education. And I remember how I would hear Army lawyers talk and other officers, and just a turn of a phrase or you change a few words and somebody could get promoted or not promoted. You could be found guilty or not guilty. So I started thinking to myself, you know what? When I get out of the Army, I'm going to become a lawyer. So I started telling everybody that. But most of the time when an officer heard me say something like that, they would just roll their eyes. But I would keep on saying it. In fact, one officer actually said to me, "Listen, you don't even have a college degree. You need to focus your attention on being a paratrooper. That's your job." Well, from that point forward, I started taking college classes at night. I remember showing up to class dirty, bleeding, hurting, stinky, funky. But 7 years from this period, and 2 years after I actually retired from the Army, I did earn my bachelor's degree. Well, the first thing I did after that is I started applying to law schools. But it didn't take long before those little envelopes started to arrive. Rejection. We're sorry. Rejection. 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 But one day, a big envelope came in the mail. I was accepted to law school. I am going to law school. I told everybody, guess what? I am going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to help the little guy. I'm going to help everybody. In fact, one of my friends in the Army said to me, "Hey, Ray, you think you could help me sue the Army?" Hell yeah, I'm helping everybody. I'm going to be a lawyer for everybody on earth. Well, when I got to law school, I was not the typical law student. Not at 38 years old, not being a combat vet, not having PTSD and 4 children. I was different. And I mean, law school was hard. It's hard to help your kids with their algebra homework. But reading 200 pages a night was difficult. And I didn't make friends easily. But there were 3 older guys in the law school that became friends of mine. They started palling around with me. But almost right away, after the midterm exams were completed, I had failed every one. And the only chance that I had now to finish law school was I had to ace all the final exams. It wasn't long after this period that I got this message that the assistant dean of the law school wanted to speak to me in his office. I went to his office, and I remember he had his back turned to me when he said, "You should withdraw." I said, "I don't want to withdraw. I'm not going to quit. I spent my whole life thinking." He said again, "You should withdraw. And if you should graduate, I'll eat my hat." When I walked out of his office, I started thinking about what my mama had said. You'll never know what it's like to be ignorant. But I did in that moment. Later, I saw this sign on the wall. It was announcing the Mary Wright Closing Argument Competition. This is the highlight of the law school year. All the top law students and the law professors, they pick out these students they want to mentor, and they work on this competition. It is a big deal. The whole law school turns out to see it. And this is what I had came to law school for. This was like being a lawyer on TV. This is what I wanted to do. But I also knew that I wasn't doing well in law school. In fact, when a law professor heard that I was thinking about it, he said to me, "Look, you need to focus your attention on academics and not extracurricular activity." So at that point, I forgot about it. But my 3 older friends, they came to me and they say, "Ray, man, you ought to do it anyway. This is what we do. This is what you talk about. Come on, what do you got to lose? Try it. So, okay, I'm in. But I couldn't get any law professors to work with me. And a few weeks prior to the competition, I really hadn't done anything at all. I wrote a few notes on a tissue paper, and that's all the preparation I had. And the way the competition worked, you're standing outside, and the whole law school is inside. You knock on the door, you go in, people would make their presentation, you'd hear applause. Next person would go in, make their presentation, you'd hear applause. Then my turn came. And when I went in, I knew that I couldn't talk about any fine points of the law. I couldn't talk about elements of torts. I couldn't talk to them about subject matter jurisdiction. But I could tell them a story. I could tell them about right and wrong. I could tell them about justice and injustice. And I closed with this line. And just like the boogeyman that lives under my girl's bed, made up from dust bunnies, buttons, and lost Christmas toys, exposed to the light, the prosecution's case just isn't there. And I walked the hell out. But I walked out to complete silence. But soon as the door closed behind me, I heard what sounded like thunder. And that was the sound of the entire law school applauding all at once. I never went back inside, but I couldn't help but cry. Well, the final exams would come and they would go. And 2 weeks later, I would find out I won the competition. Mm-hmm. But 4 weeks later, I would find out I was being academically dismissed from law school. I was broken. I never felt so bad in my life. I thought about how embarrassed I was. I thought about all the people I was never going to help, all the things I was never going to do. And it took me a while to think to myself, maybe, just maybe, I did get a feather in my head. Maybe I did get a gold star. I mean, I beat out some of the smartest people in the law school at their own game. And if I hadn't had this stupid idea of becoming a lawyer, I would have never went to college. I'd have never earned graduate degrees in history and education. I never would have became a college professor. I wouldn't be halfway completed with my dissertation right now. So the journey didn't take me to a place where I could knock out injustice in the courtroom, but the journey did take me to a place where I could combat ignorance in the classroom. So, I guess in some ways that's the end of the beginning of my storyteller's journey. Now, since that story was told, I had a stroke. I earned my doctorate in education. Yeah, a few changes. Some takeaways. Life happens first. Stories are there. We all have them. Not much separates me from you, but time and distance. It's all about getting those stories heard if that's something that you're interested in. You can't get rich telling stories. I remember a producer telling me that, and that is still true right now. Oh, wait a minute. You should still dream. Okay, I can't get rich telling stories. You may be able to get rich telling stories. So, keep your dreams. Keep telling them. So, this one is done. This podcast is produced by me with special assistance from Dr. T. And remember, this is a love podcast. I don't make money on this podcast. This podcast costs me money. I am the podcast producer, editor, researcher, and host, and I also clean up the table after I am done. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you more often. I need to hear from you. Would you like to hear this podcast on a regular basis? Would you like to see this podcast go live? You know what? Me too. But so far, it ain't happening. So share with a friend. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And until next time, bye.
You have been listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast, hosted by Ray Christian. You can find What's Ray Saying on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. If you've got comments, questions, or feedback, you can always reach us via Facebook or by emailing whatsraysaying@gmail.com. Ray says each episode is made with love, fatback, chicken feed, and fresh mountain spring water, but none of these are legal tender according to the electric company. To help this listener-supported podcast pay the bills and keep producing episodes like the one you just heard, you can click on our Donate tab on Facebook or go to paypal.me/whatsraysaying. Tell a friend or 2 or 12 or 20 what you just heard on What's Ray Saying, the podcast. Until next time.
What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? He will tell you about